known for tea, toast, beans, funny fake accents, and of course, the royal family. Nestled on the Isle of Great Britain, south of Scotland, and to the east of Wales, the country has a vast, storied, and often confusing history. Most of this comes from the royal family, the focus of this video, and specifically for us, King Edward II. Edward II faced heavy scrutiny, as did many monarchs of England, but his opposition came almost immediately. He was questioned for his choices in advisors, and as we'll come to see, the nature of his relationships with them. But he moved and ruled with conviction. He favored his beloved men with faithfulness, despite their lack of qualifications and the poor rationales for their positions of power. This is the story of Edward II, but this is not a happy story. This is a cautionary tale about a man who put his own personal desires over the people he should have led. This is a story of jealousy and a story of a lot of English politics. So, if that's not your thing, go back to your short-form content. Go melt your brain if you wanna. It's funny because he says the word hell funny, but if not, come with me as we learn about the dangers of ruling through others. Because the fact of the matter was, Edward II was not a good king. But despite it, he remained true to not only himself, but those who were loyal to him. And he continued as a extremely polarizing figure. Edward's story begins on April 24th, 1284. He was born to Edward I and Eleanor of Castile, and lived a rather normal life for a child of nobility, with a few iniquities. As a child, he took interest in horse riding, ditching, and hedging, activities associated with laborers and lower-class workers. But these were not activities of a royal, and this minor controversy would follow him his entire life. The young royal loved animals, especially dogs, and particularly greyhounds. As he grew older, of course, he gained more and more power politically, serving as regent, essentially the stand-in for the king, when his father campaigned against the French in 1297 and 1298. It was around this time in the early 1300s when Edward found himself growing close to a certain Piers Gaveston, a son of one of the knights in the lands adjacent to Gascony, where Edward's father had been campaigning. This relationship with Piers Gaveston would go on to be the catalyst for the controversy and conflict that would be caused in his early days as the King of England. Now, Edward's father took notice of this budding friendship and exiled Gaveston in 1307, a common theme of this story. Court records show that it was a temporary and short exile for Gaveston, but no official reason was ever listed. However, a couple different theories float around, including that Edward's father believed Gaveston was a bad influence on his son, or that it was simply a way to punish Edward for his simple misbehavior, a medieval equivalent to confiscating that darn PS5. Either way, in that same year, the king campaigned north into Scotland. Haha, get out your Braveheart references now. Now, Prince Edward was supposed to join this campaign north. However, the king fell ill and died in his travels. This meant that there was a need for a new king, of which Edward would take the role of. It was on July 20th of that year, 1307, that Edward II became King of England. Shortly thereafter, he continued his father's campaign against the Scots, but only briefly. After a short march north, he returned home, where he promptly recalled Gaveston from exile. And this is where, really, the questions started to come. The suspicions started to arise. The doubts were started to be cast. Almost immediately after Gaveston returned to England, he was given the title of Earl of Cornwall. Earls were essentially kind of like governors a little bit. They would live a very rich lifestyle and would sit quite pretty in their lavish castles. The title of earldom would come from appointment and from inheritance, but Gaveston's was an appointment. But this role specifically, the Earl of Cornwall, was an appointment only made and created specifically for those who the king wished to be ruling beside them. In modern times, it has become the Duchy of Cornwall, where the eldest son of the British throne resides and holds the title. But why? How was he deserving? What were his qualifications? Well,
shoot.
Some would say he wasn't. Some would say that Edward just kind of liked the way he looked, I guess. And spoiler alert, homosexuality was not cool back then.
It's important to note that in this piece of history, the hate towards homosexuality was rampant. It's why it's hard to determine the true and exact nature of the two's relationship. If it were confirmed, the word would have gotten out, he would have been dethroned, and things would have been hellish. The story would be over swiftly, but no one stepped forward in the time to confirm such an allegation against the king. Regardless of the truth, he was now the Earl of Cornwall, he was powerful, and he was evidently the king's favorite. He was so trusted by the king, in fact, that upon leaving England and heading toward France to marry Isabella, the daughter of the French king Philip IV, Gaveston served as Edward's custos regni, or keeper of the kingdom. Apart from being the coolest title ever, this also meant he held all of the powers the monarch would hold while the king was away. Quite odd, considering he was just a normal man, only given a title because of his favorable look from the king. He had no political experience, no governing skills. He was just simply the favorite. It eventually got to a point that some even considered that two kings coexisted in the kingdom. In 1308, the king was off to France, preparing to be wed. Before the ceremony began in Boulogne, France, yes, appreciate my French accent, please. Tensions grew between Edward and the French king Philip IV. The two really just didn't like each other, and Philip had strict demands that must be fulfilled were Edward to marry his daughter. His 12-year-old daughter, by the way.
12. But it was a different time, so you know.
Except for the fact that at the coronation in England a month later, Edward spent nearly the entire time with his good friend, you know him, you love him, Piers Gaveston. Okay, well, pretty much everyone noticed, both French and English contingencies. No one was happy, and shortly after the heat was back to Gaveston, Parliament met in February of 1308. Edward was open to the discussions of government reform of which was being requested, but the barons, or the elites of England, refused to move forward with the issue of Gaveston still high. It looked as though those discussions would end in violence, but with the calm, cool, and moderate presence of Henry de Lacy, Earl of Lincoln, the barons were convinced to back down. 2 months later, Parliament met once again, with the barons once again criticizing Gaveston and even requesting his exile. Now, this was backed by Isabella and the French monarchy. People really didn't like Gaveston. After heavy resistance from Edward protecting his beloved Gaveston, he inevitably acquiesced, and thus Gaveston was exiled and sent to Northern Ireland with the given title of Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. Were he to return, he would face excommunication, meaning stripped of the association with the church and its people.
Which, if you don't know, excommunication is a big deal. Back in those days, not only did it mean you were separated from the church, but it also meant that you were pretty much separated from everyone you knew. Even the threat of excommunication was a big deal. The threat itself was put on by a certain Robert Winchelsea, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury.
But yeah, Edward still found a loophole to maintain the high standing of his buddy's name via the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland position, while still technically exiling him from England. Do you know what's even better? A day earlier, on the 16th of June, 1308, Richard de Burgh, the Earl of Ulster, was given the position of Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. And then the next day, Edward changed his mind and gave Gaveston the position. Richard de Burgh was one of the most powerful nobles at the time, and his daughter would even end up marrying Robert the Bruce, the leader of Scotland who directly opposed Edward and England his entire reign. A few months after this, Edward began working to get his best friend back to England. He went working on negotiations with King Philip IV and directly with the Pope. He told Pope Clement V that he would free Bishop Walter Langton from prison in exchange for the threat of excommunication on Gaveston to be lifted. Who was Bishop Langton? Well, when Edward was just a prince, he had an argument with his father over his allowance. The royal treasurer at the time happened to be Bishop Langton. Langton, of course, took the side of his father, for he was the king after all. The prince was not a fan, and he remembered. In fact, once he became king, he stripped Langton of his role as treasurer and had him arrested. So yeah, childish. But it happened, and in order to get Gaveston back in England, he would undo it. By June, Gaveston returned. To appease those who may not take lightly to his return, Edward catered to them at the meeting of Parliament next month. He agreed to limit the power of the king's close advisors and regulate the powers of purveyance. which is essentially the right to the crown to seize goods and money when deemed important or necessary. In return for an implementation of these limitations, fresh taxes were raised to fund a campaign north against Scotland. Perhaps the crown and barons were at peace, at an understanding. Perhaps the blood of one another would not be spilled. Things, for now, were calm between the barons and the crown, but not for long. A short while after understandings, promises, handshakes, and agreements had been made, Gaveston began to overstep. Gaveston bathed in arrogance. He knew he was untouchable, for now at least, and held on to that. He pushed the limits and he tested everyone's patience. Guy Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, was, for example, called the Dog of Warwick.
Yeah, and guess what, pal? We'll see how that little slight, that little insult, that little jab. Yeah, we'll see how that disrespect works out for Gaveston in the end. Sorry.
In 1310, multiple earls, largely those who opposed Gaveston, refused to meet at Parliament because of Gaveston's attendance. During said meeting, however, the king was pressured to drop Gaveston as his advisor and instead adopt a group of ordainers made up of 21 figures, 8 earls, 7 bishops, and 6 barons. And so he did. It was that or continue forward his rule with Gaveston in danger. As the ordainers began work on their legislation, Edward and Gaveston continued to work together in the limited amount of time that was left. They took an army of just under 5,000 men to Scotland to continue the spotty war efforts that were perpetually ongoing. The efforts continued through winter in late 1310 and early 1311. Eventually, the army ran out of provisions and were forced to retreat and return to England. By October of 1311, the ordainers had completed their ordinances and reformations, of which Edward had no choice but to accept. The key members of the ordainers consisted of Henry de Lacy, Earl of Lincoln. Mentioned before, he was considered the peacekeeper of the party. He was the leader and head figure until he abdicated his position to his son-in-law, Thomas, Earl of Lancaster. He was the son-in-law of Henry de Lacy and was actually the cousin of King Edward. Despite the relation, he was one of his biggest critics and was the face of opposition. Guy Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick. Warwick had a particular hatred of Gaveston, which was reasonable, and we will soon see how far his hatred would go. Aymar de Valence, Earl of Pembroke. Hold on a second. Pembroke was originally considered part of the baronial and Reformation side, but his allegiance would swap to that of the king. Robert Winchelsea, Archbishop of Canterbury. Winchelsea fought for the autonomy and church against Edward I, but paid the price via exile. Upon being named king, Edward II reinstated Winchelsea, but Winchelsea took a position opposing the king. Walter Langton, Bishop of Lichfield. Langton, as we've discovered previously, had an altercation with Edward II in his teenage years, and the two have had a poor relationship since. This thorn would likely be the reason for Winchelsea's opposition to the king. Now that we've discussed who the ordainers are, what do the ordinances mean and do? Essentially, they place limits on the king. He should only be accounting his officers by the council and assent of the baronage. He could also not go to war without the consent of the baronage, and could not make change to the coinage without baronage consent. Another major article was focused on Gaveston and highlighted his transgressions, resulting in him being forcibly exiled despite the king's wishes. So Gaveston was gone, away from England, and it was believed he was in northern France for the extent of his exilement. But it's really rather unimportant, for he returned at the end of the year. It was likely because of the birth of his daughter, but we all know that he came back for a different baby. I'm not reading that. In early 1312, the duo reunited, and by early January 18th, the king restored his titles and lands.
Shockingly, the barons were not too happy with that. Yeah, I don't know why. Why would they? Why on earth would they not be happy with that? Can someone explain? Can someone make that clear?
As his return became public, both the royal and baronial sides of the conflict prepared for war. The barons roused the realm against the king. The archbishop declared Gaveston excommunicated for the church, and the earls of Pembroke and Warenne were tasked with capturing Gaveston. And meanwhile, Gaveston reinforced Scarborough Castle. On May 4th of 1312, Edward and Gaveston escaped a force led by the Earl of Lancaster at Newcastle. Gaveston fled to Scarborough and the king to York. The Earl of Pembroke and the Earl of Warenne followed Gaveston and besieged the castle. Gaveston surrendered, and he was brought to York for negotiations with the king. Gaveston was quite the bargaining piece when the king was involved. After the first meeting with the king, Gaveston was left with the Earl of Pembroke. They went south for his safekeeping. The Earl of Pembroke left Gaveston on June 9th in order to go visit his wife. The Earl of Warwick found the location of Gaveston and rode off, capturing him the next morning. With this attack on the Earl of Pembroke's honor and duty, he shifted his position away from the alignment of the barons. He had been crossed, and his reputation felt the blow. The Earl of Warwick forced Gaveston to face trial, which was rather rigged. It was decided he was to be put down.
Wow, look at that reference. You get it? Because he called the other guy a dog, and now he's getting put down. Yes.
Just 10 days after the Earl of Pembroke had left Gaveston, Gaveston had been killed. June 19th was his final day, a day our king, Edward II, would never forget.
I know up until this point, this seems like a story about Piers Gaveston, not really Edward II, but that's kind of the point, right? I mean, Edward sucked because he ruled through others. He was a puppet of a man. Everyone hated Gaveston, except for Edward.
With this disgrace committed by the barons, largely in part by the Earl of Warwick and the Earl of Lancaster, the Earl of Surrey switched alliances to join the king. They could not stand beside such foul souls and swore themselves to the king. In December of that same year, treaty negotiations began between the crown and the barons. The barons were looking for pardons, and the king was looking for support of the new war effort against the eternal enemy of the Scots. These discussions continued into 1313, but eventually an agreement would be reached. It only took so long because of the Earl of Lancaster and the Earl of Warwick, the everlasting thorns in Edward's side. However, north in Scotland, Robert the Bruce was recapturing castles that were previously under English control. With a lot more money, Edward initiated a military effort to retake land once owned by him, with an army numbering between 15 to 20,000. In 1314, as Edward was bolstering his forces, the Stirling Castle, a key fortification in Scotland, was besieged and retaken by the Scots. In late May, the king heard this news and sped up his march towards Stirling. Robert the Bruce had an army of somewhere between 5,000 to 7,000 men and set a new defensive position in a hunting ground a mile or two south of Stirling. There, Edward took a devastating blow as he sent 2 cavalry squads ahead to Stirling, and they were intercepted by a defensively set Scottish army. This was a turning point not just in the war, but Edward's reign. This loss was only to be further increased. The second day of the battle, Edward ordered his cavalry to charge, but they were unable to break the Scottish lines of defense. With that, Robert the Bruce, or as I like to call him, Bob the Bruce, ordered a countercharge, and the English forces were ravaged. Edward wished to stay and fight with his men, but the Earl of Pembroke grabbed the king by his collar and forced him to retreat. It was death if he were to stay. This was widely considered the turning point of the Scottish independence efforts. However, it would not be officially recognized until after Edward's reign ended. Upon this defeat, the Earl of Lancaster attempted to bring back the ordinances, or another doctrine that would achieve similar efforts. He was trying to do so as the new head of the Royal Council. After hardly any time at all, he abandoned his role, either due to disputes with other barons, declining health, or both. For the next 2 years, the Earl of Lancaster refused to even meet Edward in Parliament. To the public, this exacerbated the fears of an incoming civil war. It was evident nothing was to be achieved with disagreements between the two parties, so the Earl of Pembroke brought the Earl of Lancaster, the king, and their parties together with a treaty. It established a new council that pardoned the Earl of Lancaster in early August of 1318. Before the treaty was signed, Edward's rule was facing even greater opposition as the country struggled with famine. As a result, revenue for the country was facing new lows that the people could not handle. More and more, Edward's rule was insufficient for the standards of the people, and the conditions were poor for the majority of the populace for a time that was much, much too long. As a result of this weakness and famine, the Scottish army, still led by Bob the Bruce, invaded northern England. Edward launched an expensive yet unsuccessful counter-campaign for defense in 1319. During this, the brother of Robert, Edward Bruce, invaded Ireland in 1315, and he declared himself the High King of Ireland. But it was a few years later, in 1318, the land was retaken by the English, and Edward Bruce's head was sent to the king. All the while, declining living conditions in the kingdom led to a number of revolts, such as the Lancashire and Bristol revolts in 1315, and in Glamorgan. Okay. However, they were all suppressed. Okay, just to recap, this guy has had civil, foreign, wars, loss, famine, revolts, rebellions, not doing great. So why not throw in probably the best story of all time? Let's talk about John Dratus. First and most importantly, this guy, in 1318, claimed he was the rightful king of England, and that he was the actual real Edward II. He did bear a striking resemblance to the king, however, Dratus was missing an ear. Okay, so John Dratus, who was probably a clerk, claimed that he was the actual Edward II, and this other Edward II, the King of England, was a poser. He claimed that as a baby, one of the royal servants allowed a pig to attack him in the royal courtyard, and out of fear of execution, the servant replaced Dratus with a similar baby who still had both ears. He claimed that this explained Edward's strange style of government and his liking for lower class activities such as farming and even ditch digging. How, you might ask, would this issue be solved? How would we determine the rightful king of England? Well, Dratus had an answer.
He put forward the genius idea that him and Edward should duel for the throne. Yeah, so that didn't work.
After being arrested, Dratus claimed that his cat forced him to tell the tale, and his cat was possessed by the devil. As a result, both Dratus and his cat were hanged, the poor thing, and Dratus had his body later burnt. This guy Edward could not catch a break. On the publicity side of things for Edward, a total lunatic claiming that he should be king does not sit well or help you. While the king's reign was plunged further and further into a dark place, questions arose about his treatment of his royal favorites. He had been able to retain some of his advisors, despite efforts from the ordainers to remove them from council. As if it were a joke, Gilbert de Clare, the second richest earl in England, passed away. More bureaucratic issues that would result in happy endings and smiles all around, right? No, de Clare had no direct descendants, and thus the will was in possession of the crown while the matters of inheritance were being determined. The three sisters of the earl were all married to some of Edward's favorites, in Hugh Despencer the younger, Hugh de Audley, and Roger de Moray. The inheritance was shared equally between the three, but Despencer received the most politically important lordship, Glamorgan in Wales. What a goofy. Despite the victory Despencer took in negotiation, he was determined to have the king assist him in taking control of other lands along the English-Welsh border. This did not go without punishment, as the realm was plunged into yet another civil war, with the Earl of Lancaster at the forefront, being a fierce rival of Despencer. It was anticipated that yet again the Earl of Pembroke would be the one to work on negotiations between the Earl of Lancaster's parties and that of the crown, but he was seemingly absent. He spent much of the time before the war in France, searching for a wife, as an excuse to stay away from the conflict that was brewing. He felt less important in the court of the king, as the Despensers, both younger and elder, grew more powerful each and every day, with them being the new equivalency of Gaveston to the king. Thus, he spent as much time as he could away from the king before he must share the bad news.
What bad news could there be? The nation was falling deeper and deeper into despair, and things looked terrible for the average common folk, but there was bad news for Edward.
Well, in March 1321, he returned and told the king that he would have to exile the Despensers for breaching the ordinances. The king didn't take it lightly, and until London was occupied by opposing noble parties, he hadn't agreed to the terms. It had become increasingly clear he would likely be deposed were he not to banish the Despensers. As the civil war dragged on, the king further and further gained advantage. It came to a point where the Earl of Lancaster was finally forced to surrender, and it resulted in his execution in late 1321. After this, the Earl of Pembroke, along with other nobles, were forced to beg forgiveness of Edward. They also had to claim they only supported and asked for the exile of the Despensers under duress. After the war, Edward set up a system of courts, where the judges were instructed on how to sentence and prosecute the defendants, who were unable to defend themselves. These defendants were labeled as contrariants, and they were punished with death, fines, and the repossession of lands. This allowed for Edward to refill his coffers and to also reward his supporters, most notably the Despensers. Shocking, right? As things seemed to become calmer at home, tensions grew between Edward and his brother-in-law, Charles IV, the new King of France. In order to mend the relationship, Edward sent his son, Edward III, and his wife, Isabella, to continue diplomatic efforts on the French front in 1325. However, only Edward's son would return. While in France, she found herself as the mistress of Roger Mortimer, a baronial opponent who fled England during the very fair and totally not rigged trials that many barons were definitely fairly executed at. With her disdain toward the Despensers, especially the younger Despensers' treatment of women, she found it easy to turn against the king. Until 1322, things had seemed to be great between Isabella and Edward. However, with the issues the Despensers had caused her and her husband, everything slowly collapsed. She had been forced to retreat from the Scottish on 3 different occasions, and she blamed the last time on the younger Despenser. She despised him for his abuse of women, and she could handle it no more when the Beaumonts, a close family to Isabella, were severely hamstrung by negotiations that were made between Edward and the Scottish. In 1326, Mortimer and Isabella invaded England with little to no resistance to face. Edward II was imprisoned by the new couple in power.
Here it's agreed upon that Edward II was imprisoned by this couple, by his former wife, by his ex. Only Edward II could be imprisoned by his ex. Still technically married, but this is where the theories start to split. Yeah, you think you're watching I bet you didn't know? You're actually watching a mystery of history. But while there is an official story, there are some other theories around what happened after Edward was imprisoned.
The most agreed upon theory is that Mortimer had Edward II executed, and that he seized the throne in 1327. Shortly after that, Edward III would retake the throne and have Mortimer executed for his many crimes, including that of the murder of Edward II. Things begin to get weirder after this. According to the Fieschi letter, a letter written by Manuel Fieschi, Edward had actually not died in 1327. Fieschi had written that he had actually escaped from the castle, and that the body buried and presented to Isabella was actually that of the porter of the Berkeley Castle in England. Upon escaping, he fled and became a hermit in the Holy Roman Empire. Now, it's important to note that Fieschi was a real guy. He was a papal notary, and he was a respected professional. There were plenty of reason to believe him. Now, this letter has been linked to a record of Edward III meeting a man called William the Welshman in Antwerp in 1338. He claimed that he was Edward II. As we've seen from Edward's story, almost everything really revolved around the characters around him. We heard stories about Gaveston, the Despensers, his wife, and even Aymer de Valence, the Earl of Pembroke. Pierre Chaplet argues that he, quote, was not so much an incompetent king as a reluctant one. Chaplet argued that he ruled through delegation, which is true. Everything he did was done through others. His rule was not even his own. Edward's story isn't really Edward's story.
Despite Edward's terrible, terrible rule, despite all of his shortcomings and the terrible king he was, he still had one thing, and that was loyalty. He put trust in those who were closest to him, and he never gave out on that trust. In another world, Edward II was a baron or an earl, and maybe he was the most loyal person and the best earl. But unfortunately, in this world, he was king. It is unfortunate, and hopefully, if you're watching this, you can learn. Leadership is not easy. A lot of times it takes listening to others and taking in their input. But a lot of times it's also going with your gut and what you believe in. I don't get it. It's a stupid video. I'm gonna watch FaZe Clan. No way, no way, no way.